You vote, you pay your taxes, you follow the rules. And every few years, the math gets a little worse. Rent a little higher, savings a little thinner. The life you are working toward, a little further away. Here's the question nobody asks out loud. If your vote is supposed to change things, why does this keep happening regardless of who wins? This episode is about that question. And the answer is more interesting and more hopeful than you might expect. This is moral economy talk. We live in time where people are working harder than ever and falling further behind. Where families feel more pressure, even when they are doing more right. Where the gap between the effort and outcome has never been wider, and nobody explains why. This podcast exists to close that gap, to take the intersection of money, family, and values and talk about it like adults. Not with a political spin, not with the financial jargon designed to make you feel small, just clear thinking for someone who has lived the pressure, done the work, and refused to pretend the system is the same as it was. Because economics is not just numbers on a government report. It is a dinner table argument you did not want to have. It is a 2 a.m. moment when you look at the ceiling and wonder if you made the right choices. It is exhaustion that has nothing to do with the laziness. This is Moral Economy Talk, and I'm your host, Aleksandar Balta. Let's get into it. Over the past 3 episodes, we have built something together. We went through math that stopped working, the housing ratio that went from 3 times income to 20 times in one generation, the grocery cart up 8%, the debt that became the entire fee to adult life. We talked about what math does to culture, to marriage, to family foundation, to the sense of who you are and what you're building. We made affirmative case that marriage and family are not outdated social conventions, but the things that the longest happiness study in history says mattered the most. At the end of each episode, we talked about what you can do. Personal choices, values, the life you build inside the constraints you have. But I have been aware of something across all 3 episodes, a question that has been sitting underneath every conversation we have had. A question I have been circling around without asking directly. And I want to ask it directly today. If the math is broken in ways that are consequential, if the housing ratio, the wage gap, the debit culture and fertility collapse, the marriage delay, all of this as documented as serious as research shows, then why does it keep getting worse regardless of which party is in power? Why does the fundamental economic architecture of working people's lives seem to be essentially changed by elections? Why does the person who votes one way and the person who votes the opposite way end up in the same kitchen, looking at the same bills, having the same conversation about whether the math works this month? The honest answer to that question requires understanding something that most people have a vague sense of but have never had explained clearly. And I want to explain it today without anger, without conspiracy theory, and without telling you which side to be on, because this is not a left or right issue. It is a question of who is actually in the room when the rules get written. I came to Canada as an immigrant. My father came with nothing. And the thing that struck me the most about this country and about North America more broadly was how much freedom there is appeared to be, how open the system seemed, how genuinely possible it felt to build something from nothing if you were willing to work for it. And that is real. That is not an illusion. Well, what I build it here. What my father built, the opportunity is real. But there is a difference between opportunity and a level playing field. And the more I have studied the economic architecture of North America, the more I have looked at who makes decisions that shape the conditions in what the opportunity operates, the more I have understood that the playing field has not been level for a long time. Not because of any single villain, not because of a conspiracy, but because rules are written by the people, and people write rules that serve the interests of the people they are accountable to. And working families are not always in that room. Let me show you specifically what I mean. But before I do, I want to name something, because I know what some people are thinking when they hear an episode framed this way. They're thinking, oh, here comes the conspiracy theory. Here comes they who are pulling the strings and want to be honest with you from the start. This is not what this is. I'm not going to tell you there is a shadowy group of elites meeting in secret to engineer poverty. That framing is both inaccurate and useless because it requires you to believe in a level of coordinating and malevolence that is frequently harder to maintain than actual truth. The actual truth is more mundane and in some ways more unsettling. The systems do not require conspiracy to produce outcomes that serve some people better than others. They only require that the people with the most access to people who make decisions be consistently present in those conversations. And the people with the most resources are consistently the most present. Not because they are evil, because they have the resources to be present. And over time, the decisions reflect whose presence was most consistent. This is the whole story. This is the mechanism. And once you understand it, you can begin to think about what would actually take to change it. Let me ask you something. When you last went to the polls, municipal, provincial, or state, federal, who were you voting for? Your local representative, your member of parliament or Congress, maybe a party leader or a president. Now, let me ask you this. Did you vote for the person who set the interest rate on your mortgage? You did not. Nobody does. Because that decision is made by the people who were never on your ballot. In the United States, interest rate decisions are made by Federal Open Market Committee. The FOMC has 12 voting members. 7 of them sit on the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate, each serving staggered 14-year terms. The other 5 are drawn from the president of the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. The president of New York Fed always has a vote. The rest rotate. Here's the important thing to understand. These 12 people meet 8 times a year. They vote on federal funds rate, the rate that flows downstream into every mortgage, every car loan, every credit card, and every business loan in the United States. Their decision reaches into every kitchen table conversation about money in North America, and they were appointed, not elected. Their terms run longer than any president's. And the regional bank presidents who rotate in are appointed by directors of the respective regional Federal Reserve banks, not by the public at all. I want to be careful here because I'm not saying the Federal Reserve is corrupt or that these are bad people. Many of them are highly accomplished economists who take their mandate seriously. The Federal Reserve has a mandate from Congress: maximum employment and stable prices, and it operates within the mandate. This is not a conspiracy, it is a structure. What I'm saying is that the structure concentrates enormous economic power in the hands of people who are not accountable to you in the way your elected representatives are. When the Federal Reserve raised interest rates aggressively in 2022 and 2023 to fight inflation, mortgage rates in both the United States and Canada doubled in less than 18 months. The average 30-year fixed mortgage rate in the U.S. went from around 3% in early 2022 to above 7% by late 2023, according to Freddie Mac data. For a family trying to buy a first home, the rate change added hundreds of dollars per month to a mortgage payment on the same house. It priced millions of people out of home ownership in the exact window when they were trying to enter it. That decision was made by 12 people in Washington. None of them were on your ballot. None of them will face consequences at an election for what that decision did to your family's ability to buy a home. In Canada, the structure is different, but the principle is the same. The Bank of Canada governor is appointed by federal cabinet, appointed, not elected, to 7-year term. The governor chairs the governing council that sets the overnight rate, which flows into every variable mortgage, every line of credit, every business loan in Canada. One appointed person backed by appointed counsel making decisions that touch every Canadian household directly. Again, I am not saying these people do not work hard or that their intentions are not good. What I am saying is that there is a gap between the decisions that most directly shape your economic life and democratic accountability we are taught to believe governs how our society runs. You vote, but the person who most directly affects the number on your mortgage statement was not on your ballot. And here's the thing that nobody talks about. When they talk about the housing crisis, the affordability crisis, the cost of living crisis, these are not mysterious market forces that arrived without the cause. They are the downstream consequences of specific decisions made by specific people inside the specific institutions. Understanding who those people are and how they got there is the first step to understanding why things change slowly and what would actually take to change them faster. Now, let me tell you about the second piece of this architecture. The piece that is fully legal, fully documented, almost never discussed in plain language on any mainstream platform. In 2023, interest groups spent $4.2 billion lobbying in the United States federal government. This is not a typo, $4.2 billion in a single year. This is not hidden information. It is reported and tracked by Open Secrets, a nonprofit that has monitored money in American politics since 1990. To put that number in context, 4.2 billion is more than entire GDP of some countries. It is more than annual budget of many federal agencies. It is spent specifically to influence the laws and regulations that governs how the economy works. Housing policy, tax policy, healthcare policy, financial regulation, labor law. Who is spending it? In 2023, The health and the pharmaceutical sector spent over $739 million on federal lobbying, more than any other sector. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the largest business advocacy organization in the country, spent $69 million in 2023 alone. National Association of Realtors spent $52 million in 2023 and $82 million. National Association of Realtors spent $52 million in 2023 and $82 million in 2022, making it the single highest spending lobby group in America that year. Let me stop on that last one. The National Association of Realtors, because I think it illustrates exactly what lobbying actually does and why it matters to every conversation we have had on this show. The National Association of Realtors publicly says it supports housing affordability. Their website, their press releases, their congressional testimony, all of it uses the language of affordable housing, access for the first-time buyer, or the American dream of home ownership. And in 2022, they spent $82 million lobbying Congress, more than any other organization in America. What are they actually lobbying for? According to Open Secrets data, the top lobbying party in 2022 was the Inflation Reduction Act. Specifically, they were working to remove tax provisions that would have generated revenue used for affordable housing investment. They successfully lobbied to strip several of those provisions out. I want to be careful here. Lobbying is legal. The National Association of Realtors is a legal organization representing real estate professionals who have legitimate business interests. I'm not accusing anyone of a crime. I'm describing a structure in which the interests of real estate professionals who profit from higher home prices and represented in the halls of Congress by $82 million worth of professional advocacy. And the interests of the first-time buyer who needs lower prices are represented by whatever time a working person can spare after their job, their family, and their commute. That is not a conspiracy. That is a resource disparity and produces outcomes. I have a friend who works in construction. He builds the homes. He has building them for 15 years. He's skilled. He's experienced. He's the kind of worker that every housing market in North America claims to be desperately needed. And he cannot afford to buy one of the homes he builds. He told me once, I have thought about this sentence many times since, and he said, I put my hands on every piece of this house, and I will never own one like it. He said it without bitterness, just as a statement of fact. If he had made a peace with an argument that he did not fully understand, but had accepted as a permanent condition of his life, that arrangement was not inevitable. It was produced by decades of policy decisions shaped by $4.2 billion a year worth of professional influence from people whose interests are not his. In Canada, lobbying structure is smaller in scale, but the principle is the same. The Office of the Commissioner of Lobbying of Canada tracks registered federal lobbyists and their activities. The real estate and financial services industries are consistently among the most active. The mortgage and real estate and sector lobbied extensively against measures that would have introduced foreign buyer taxes or restricted investment property ownership in a ways that might have reduced prices. The very policies most likely to help the first time buyer are the ones most consistently opposed by the most well funded lobbying operations. I want to say this clearly one more time. This is not left or right. This is not a partisan argument. Lobbying happens on every government. Both parties in the United States have accepted money from same industries. Both governing parties in Canada have faced the same lobbying pressures. The structure does not change with the party in power. It changes only when the people outside the structure understand it clearly enough to determine that it does. There is one more piece of this architecture I want to name before we talk about both political parties, and then we talk about what has actually worked. It is called the revolving door. And once you know about it, you see it. The revolving door is the movement of people between the government roles. As a regulators, legislator, policymakers, and private sector roles in industries they previously regulated and legislated. A banking regulator leaves the government position and takes a senior role at a major bank. A healthcare official moves from overseeing pharmaceutical approvals to the board of a pharmaceutical company. A housing policy advisor leaves government and joins the real estate investment firm. This is legal. It happens constantly. I want to explain why it matters structurally, not as a moral judgment of any individual who has ever made this kind of career move. When a regulator knows that their likely next career step is a senior position in the industry they currently regulate, their regulatory decisions are consciously or not influenced by that knowledge, not through direct corruption, through the natural human tendency to avoid burning bridges with people who might one day be your colleagues or employers. Through the way extended professional contact within the industry shapes how you see its interest, though the access that the industry has to your office because of the shared professional world you inhabit. This is documented extensively in academic research on regulatory behavior. Harvard Law School professor Lawrence Lessig has written about it at length. Former Federal Reserve economists have published on it. It's not a fringe theory. It is a well-studied feature on how a regulatory institution functions when the regulatory industry is powerful enough to offer significantly better compensation than government. Let me tell you about the moment that brought this home for me personally. I was reading a news story about regulatory decision on mortgage lending rules, the kind of dry policy stories that most people scroll past. And I noticed that the person quoted defending the policy decision had 3 years earlier been a senior executive of one of the largest financial institutions most directly affected by the policy. They had moved from a private sector into the regulatory role. The argument for the policy was entirely coherent, technically well reasoned. And I found myself wondering, what would the same person have made the same argument if they had spent their career working with the families trying to access those mortgages instead of the institutions issuing them? I do not know answer to that. Neither do you. Neither does anyone. That is the problem with a revolving door. It does not produce demonstrably corrupt decisions. It produces a particular orientation and a particular understanding of whose interests are real and whose abstract that shapes policy in ways that are nearly impossible to trace directly by real in aggregate effect. The construction worker who cannot buy the house he builds never gets to sit across the regulator and explains his experience. The first time buyer who got priced out last year does not have a former colleague in a relevant agency. The working family carrying $48,000 in debt does not have lobbyists. And so the architecture of policy continues to be shaped primarily by the people who can most easily access the people who make it. I want to give you one concrete example how the revolving door shows up in a housing conversation specifically. In both Canada and the United States, the real estate investment trust industry, REITs, has grown substantially over the past 2 decades. REITs are financial vehicle that allow large institutional investors to own residential real estate at scale. They buy apartment buildings, they buy single family homes, and they are governed by the tax rules that were originally designed to encourage investment in the commercial real estate but have been extended to residential properties. The people who wrote and extended those tax rules, the regulatory officials and legislative staffers who shaped the specific provisions, did not do so in a vacuum. They did it in an environmental where a financial industry, including the real estate investment industry, was consistently present in their professional lives. Through lobbying, through industry conferences, through professional networks that connect government services to private sector careers. I'm not saying corruption, I'm saying orientation. The orientation of the people shaping the rules was shaped by the people who had most consist access to them. And result is a tax and regulatory environment that makes it significantly easier for large institution investor to own and manage residential properties than it is for the first-time buyer to compete for the same property. That did not happen by the accident. It happened through the accumulation of dozens of small decisions made by the people whose professional orientation pointed consistently in one direction. Understanding this does not make you powerless. It makes you specific. A vague anger at broken system is exhausting and produces nothing. The specific understanding of mechanism that produces the problem is the foundation of effective advocacy for changing it. I have been careful not to name parties in this episode. I want to explain why, because I think the reason matters. When I look at economic architecture, we have been describing the unelected monetary policymakers, the $4.2 billion lobbying machine, the revolving door between regulation and industry. I cannot honestly tell you that one party built this and the other would dismantle it. The history does not support that story. The Federal Reserve structure has existed since 1913. Here it has operated under Democratic and Republican presidents, liberal and conservative Canadian governments for over a century. The lobbying industry in Washington has grown steadily under administrations of every political stripe. The National Association of Realtors donate to candidates from both major parties in 2022 election cycle, according to Open Secret data. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has historically supported candidates from both parties, particularly incumbents with the committee positions relevant to business regulations. The financial industries, the banks, the asset managers, the insurance companies, distributes its political donation across party lines with the strategic consistency of an organization that understands it will need access to regardless who wins. This is not a cynical argument that nothing matters or that voting is pointless. I want to be precise about what I am and I am not saying. I'm saying that the fundamental economic architecture the rules governing how wealth is created, how it is taxed, how housing markets operate, how financial institutions are regulated, changes very slowly regardless of which party holds power. Because that architecture is not primarily the product of electoral politics. It is the product of the sustained, professional, well-funded influence of the interests that benefit from it. The partisan culture war, the constant, exhausting, all-consuming argument about social issues, about identity, about which side is more threatening, survives a particular function that I want you to think about. When your attention is fully occupied by argument between the team A and the team B, you're not asking the questions we asked at the start of this episode. Who is in the room when the rules get written? Who benefits from way things are? What would actually have to change for the math to work for working families? I'm not saying the culture wars issues are unimportant. Some of them generally matter. But I'm saying that an exhausted, divided, mutual, and rage population is a population that is significantly less effective at the kind of organized, sustained civic engagement that has historically been necessary to change economic architecture. And the people who benefit most from a current architecture are not harmed by exhaustion or your division. They are protected by it. I remember a conversation with a man I worked in the trade, smart man, passionate, spent enormous energy at every election cycle, absolutely convinced that the other party was the source of every problem he faced. And I thought about that specific problems he faced, the housing costs, the stagnant wages, the debt. And I thought about how carefully those problems track the decisions made by institutional lobbying operations that had been operating continuously through every election he had ever participated in. His passion was real. His investment in the outcome was genuine. But the thing he was most angry about and the thing that was most affecting his actual life were not the same thing. Here's the thing about the media on both sides that I want to say clearly. A person watching hours of political news every day, regardless of which channel, is a person who is being served content that is optimized for engagement, which means content that produces strong emotional reactions, which means content that confirms what you already believe and enrages you about what you feel. That is not journalism original purpose. It is business model that emerged when media became advertising supported at scale. Frightened, enraged people click more, they share more, they stay on the platform longer. They come back the next day because the story is never resolved. The enemy is never defeated. And the crisis never over. The outrage always needs replenishing. I'm not saying the news is fake. I'm saying the selection of what gets coverage and how it gets framed and what emotional response it is designed to produce. Those are choices made by people with specific business incentives. And those incentives are not the same as your interest in understanding clearly what is actually affecting your life. My father used to turn off the television and go talk to his neighbors, not because he was uninterested in the world, because he understood the difference between information and noise. The neighbors were real. The situations were specific. The problems and their solutions were concrete. Television was machine-generated feelings about distant abstractions. He knew which one was more useful. I'm not telling you who to vote for. I'm not telling you that elections do not matter. What I'm telling you is that economic architecture in North America will not be changed by a single election. It will be changed if it is changed by kind of sustained, specific, locally engaged civic pressures that the most people have never been taught to apply. I want to give you a different lens for evaluating the news, for reading policy announcements, for thinking about who is speaking to you and why. It is not a partisan lens. It is not left and right. It is simpler and more useful than either. When policy is proposed, a tax change, a housing regulation, a financial rule, a healthcare decision, instead of asking, is this a conservative or liberal idea? Ask two questions. Question one, who benefits if this passes? Question two, who pays for it directly or indirectly? Those two questions applied consistently will tell you more about what is actually happening than any partisan framing ever will. Let me give you some examples. In 2017, the United States passed a major tax reform act that reduced the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. Who benefits? Corporations and their shareholders, who saw profits and stock prices rise significantly. Who pays? The difference in tax revenue has to come from somewhere. It either increases the deficit, which is debt passed to future generation, or it is offset by reductions in other spending. Applied consistently, the benefit went primarily to people who already own significant assets. The cost was distributed more broadly, including to people who own no assets at all. I'm not saying that the tax policy is simple or there is no legitimate arguments for lower corporate tax. There are. Economic arguments about investment and job creations are real. I'm saying that when you apply the who benefits, who pays lens, the picture becomes clearer than the partisan framing allows. Now, apply the same lens to housing zoning policy. When a city council blocks high density housing development in an established neighborhood, who benefits? Existing homeowners whose property values are protected from the downward pressure that additional supply would create. Who pays? Renters and the first time buyers who cannot access affordable housing in that neighborhood. And who is typically more represented at a city council meetings? Established homeowners, who is typically less represented. The people who do not yet live there because they cannot afford to. Apply to pharmaceutical pricing in the United States. Who benefits from a system where the drug companies can charge what the market will bear? Pharmaceutical companies and their shareholders. Who pays? Every American who needs medication and every insurance system that covers them. The United States pays on average 2 to 3 times what Canada and European countries pay for identical drugs, according to RAND Corporation analysis. Same molecules, same efficacy, different rule about who gets to set the price. These are not trick questions with the obvious answers. They're honest questions that require honest answers. I think the habit of asking them consistently, regardless of which side is proposing the policy, is one of the most genuinely useful things any person can bring to their engagement with public life. My father never had a university education. He did not read economic policy papers, but he had version of this question that he applied instinctively. He used to say, in his broken English that got better every year, he used to say, always ask, talking and what they want from you. That is the immigrant's instinct. And when you arrive somewhere with nothing, you develop a sharp sense for the difference between people who are generally trying to help you and people who are managing you in the ways that serve their interests. He applied that instinct to politics the same way he applied it to business negotiations. I have tried to inherit that instinct. I think it is one of the most genuinely radical things you can do in the current media environment, which is designed to generate heat rather than light, to divide rather than clarify, to keep you engaged and agitated rather than informed and effective. Ask who benefits, ask who pays, follow the thread wherever it leads. I want to spend next few minutes on something different because this episode could end as a description of a system too large and too entrenched to change. And that would be the both inaccurate and unfair to the people who actually change things. So let me tell you what has worked. Vienna, Austria, is the most livable city in the world according to Economist Intelligence Unit's Global Livability Index, ranked number one consistently for years. It is also the world's largest provider of social housing. 60% of Vienna's approximately 1.9 million residents live in municipally owned or subsidized apartments. A woman named Maria Eder has lived in one of the Vienna's most famous social housing buildings since 1978. Her 50 square meter apartment costs her €251 a month in a city that is consistently ranked among the best places on earth to live. That is not an accident. It is not socialism in the way the word gets weaponized in North America political debates. It is a city that decided 100 years ago that housing is a human right, not a financial instrument, and built the institutional infrastructure to act on that behalf. The result is that renters in Vienna spend on average 21% of their household income on housing. Now you take renters in Vancouver spend over 40%. The difference is not geography or culture. It is a policy. It is a decision made by specific people inside specific institutions about who housing is supposed to serve. The point is not that North America should copy Vienna exactly. The point is that the housing problem is not unsolvable. It has been solved, not everywhere, not without trade offs, but the evidence that can be done exists. The problem is not a lack of solution, it's lack of political will to implement. A political will does not arrive by itself. It is created by organized people who understand what they want and who stay engaged long enough to demand it. Let me tell you about a woman I know here in Canada. She was furious about housing costs in her neighborhood. Genuine. Specifically furious about the way I respect because she had done her homework and I understood exactly what was happening. She started showing up to city council meetings, not to perform outrage, to make specific arguments about the specific zoning rules that were blocking the construction of more housing on particular block near where she lived. She brought data, she brought neighbors, she came back meeting after meeting. 2 years later, that block got rezoned. The modest development went in, nothing dramatic, maybe 40 units of missing middle housing in a neighborhood that had resisted any density for decades. 40 families who can now afford to live in the neighborhood they could not have access before. She told me, I never thought I would care about zoning. I just got angry enough to learn what was actually causing the problem. That is how it works. Not dramatically, not all at once. One block at a time, one council meeting at a time, one person who got angry enough to learn the specific mechanism and specific levers and stayed engaged long enough to pull them. And let me talk about something that goes back to my own background. When my father came here from Yugoslavia, he came into a community of other immigrants, people who had nothing but their labor and their relationships. And they helped each other in ways that the formal economy did not. They shared information about the work. They lent each other money when the bank would not. They built informal networks of economic support that the system had not provided, and the community created for itself. That tradition is as old as a human civilization and is not gone. Credit unions, which are member owned financial cooperatives, operate on exactly this principle at scale. In Canada, credit unions hold over 400 billion in assets and return profits to their members rather than to shareholders. Their mortgage rates are often lower. Their fees are often lower. The investment in local communities by design rather than by charity. I'm not advertising for credit unions. I'm pointing at a principle. When a community owns the institution that serves it, the institution's incentives align with the community's interests. That is not a radical idea. It is a very old idea and is one of the clearest examples of how ordinary people have historically built alternatives to the system that was not serving them. And I want to close this section with something that I think gets missed in every political conversation about fixing the economy. The most important changes in economic conditions of working people throughout history do not happen because a politician decided to make them happen. They happen because enough ordinary people organized around a specific concrete demand and sustained the pressure long enough that the political cost of refusing became greater than political cost of conceding. The GI Bill in the United States after World War II, which sent generational working class men to college and helped them buy homes and build the largest middle class in American history, was not a gift from a generous government. It was the result of organized veterans and labor movements who made it clear that alternative was destabilized society. Medicare and Medicaid did not arrive because politicians potentially spontaneously decided elderly and poor Americans deserve health care. They arrived after decades of organized advocacy from people who understood the problem and refused to accept the existing answer as permanent. These are not ancient history. These are recent enough that the people who built them are within a living memory. And the lesson they carry is not that the system is easy to change. It is that the system is changeable by real people with real lives who get organized and stayed engaged and made the cost of the status quo higher than the cost of reform. That is actual mechanism of change and is available to anyone willing to use it. Three things: practical, specific things that actually move the needle. First, engage locally, not just federally. The federal government shapes the broad economic architecture, but zoning laws, property taxes, development approvals, local business regulation, these are determined at the municipal level. And municipal politics is where organized citizens have the most direct leverage. Meetings are public, the officials are accessible, the scale is human. One person who shows up consistently and speaks specifically at a city council meeting has more influence per unit of effort than same person donating to federal campaign. If housing costs are your primary concern, and they are for most people, your local council is making more decisions that directly affect those costs than your federal representative is. Second, apply who benefits, who pays lens every time you consume political media. Not to become cynical, to become clear. Every policy has a beneficiaries and costs. Every media story about policy has a framing that emphasizes some of those as obscure others. The habit of asking both questions consistently, regardless of which outlet is telling you what, or protecting against being managed rather than informed. And third, build your economic community deliberately. The immigrant tradition my father brought here pooling resources, sharing information, building networks of mutual support within the community. The tradition is available to everyone, and it does not require waiting for the system to change. Credit unions instead of banks where it makes sense for your situation. Local businesses where you can. Relationship with your actual neighbors that go beyond digital acquaintances. The economic resilience of a community is built in relationships between the people inside it, not just in the policies governing it from above. None of these three things fixes the Federal Reserve. None of them eliminates 4.2 billion of lobbying. I'm not pretending they do. What they do is begin to close the gap between the decisions being made in the rooms you are not in and a community that you are actually building in the rooms you are in. That gap is where the work happens. And the people who have historically closed it did not do it by waiting for the system to change itself. They did it by showing up, staying informed, and building the thing that needed to exist before the system was willing to provide it. I want to say something to anyone listening who feels overwhelmed by the scale of what we talked about today. The Federal Reserve, the lobbying machine, the revolving door, the media architecture. I know how that sounds when you're just trying to get through the month. It sounds like problems that are too large for an individual to affect, to entrench for any generation to change. But I grew up around people who came to this country with nothing, who did not speak the language, who did not understand the system, who faced a structural disadvantage at every level of society they were entering, and built things anyway. Not because the system made it easy, because they understood clearly what they were building towards, and they refused to let the size of obstacle determine the scale of their effort. That is the inheritance I'm trying to pass forward, not a political program, not a party platform, a way of seeing, a habit of asking the right questions, a refusal to mistake the size of problem for a limit on the size of response. The system is large. The people inside it who want it to change, for the math to work, for families to be able to build the lives they are built for, are larger. And every episode of this show is an attempt to help those people see each other. I'm the son of an immigrant who built something with nothing. I carried $48,000 in debt and worked my way to clear of it. I have sat in dark kitchen at 2 a.m. and felt what it feels like when the math does not work and person you love is awake waiting for you. I understand the pressure from the inside. And what I know from that experience with my father and you, what every person who has ever built something under difficult conditions has known, is that the system does not determine your outcome. It sets the conditions. What you do inside those conditions is still yours. And the more clearly you understand the conditions, the more effectively you can navigate them. That is what this show is for. One thing to carry from today: the system does not run on autopilot. It runs on decisions made by specific people in specific institutions with a specific interest. Understanding who those people are and how they got there and whose interests they are most accountable to, that understanding does not make you powerless. It makes you accurate. And accuracy is the foundation of effective action. The math is broken. The architecture that broke it is visible if you know where to look. The history of people who change that architecture, one city block, one policy, one institution at a time, is real and is more encouraging than the headlines suggest. Next week, episode 5, you still have agency. After 4 episodes of understanding the system, what it costs, what it does to culture and family, who runs it, and why, we close the first arc of the show with the most important conversation of all. What does a person of value do inside a broken system? Not waiting for permission, not waiting for the math to fix itself. Building the life that is worth building anyway. Subscribe to Moral Economy Talk so you do not miss it. Because money shapes how we live, but values decide who we become. This is Moral Economy Talk, and I'm your host, Aleksandar Balta, and I will see you in the next episode.